Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're sitting with something that might feel uncomfortably familiar to many of you listening. It's that space where excellence meets exhaustion, where the thing you've built your life around somehow feels both essential and depleting at the same time. If you're listening to this, you might be someone who spent years perfecting your craft. Maybe you're an equestrian feeling the weight of another season, a surgeon carrying the precision of life and death decisions, a dancer whose body knows every nuance of movement, but whose spirit feels somehow disconnected from the joy that first brought you to the studio. You love what you do. Let me say that again because it matters. You genuinely love what you do, but somewhere along the way, the love got buried under logistics, under pressure, under this constant measurement of yourself against standards that never quite feel satisfied. I want to talk today about something the research is revealing that might shift how we think about sustainable excellence. It's about the difference between performing from striving versus performing from being. And before you think this is about giving up your edge or settling for less, let me be clear. This is about finding a way to maintain world class performance while also remaining whole. It's about competing with steadiness instead of strain. Let's start with what the science is actually showing us about these two different states of being. When athletes cultivate what researchers call non striving awareness, essentially a state of being present without forcing, something remarkable happens in their bodies. Their heart rate variability increases, which is a marker of how well your nervous system can adapt and recover. Their vagal tone enhances, which is essentially your body's ability to shift into rest and recovery mode. Their heart rates actually lower. These are all signs that the parasympathetic nervous system, the part that helps you rest, digest, and restore, is coming online even in the midst of high level performance. What's particularly compelling is that these states can be trained through mindfulness practices, through specific types of meditation, through what might seem like counterintuitive being time built into training blocks. Athletes are learning to access these non striving states reliably. And here's what matters for performance. When they do this, their competitive precision actually increases. Their decision speed improves, their recovery accelerates. Think about that for a moment. By doing what seems like less, by not constantly striving, they're actually achieving more. The research on this is remarkably consistent. Meta analyses looking at mindfulness training in elite athletes show improvements in attentional control, reduced cognitive interference, and enhanced ability to read the game or situation. These athletes are processing information more efficiently, making faster and more accurate decisions under pressure, all while experiencing less subjective strain. Now, I want to acknowledge something here. For many of you, the idea of non striving might feel almost threatening. Your entire identity might be built around being someone who pushes, who strives, who never settles. And that's actually where another crucial piece of research comes in: the studies on athletic identity and its relationship to both performance and well being over time. Here's what we're learning: elite athletes who maintain what researchers call multiple valued identities, meaning they see themselves not just as an athlete or performer, but also as a mentor, a friend, a learner, a creator. These individuals show remarkably different patterns over the course of their careers compared to those with a singular, exclusive athletic identity. They experience lower rates of burnout. They show greater resilience when facing setbacks. They maintain performance longer. And perhaps most importantly, they report higher levels of life satisfaction and psychological well being throughout their careers and beyond. The research uses a term called identity foreclosure, which happens when someone's entire sense of self becomes wrapped up in one role. When this happens in athletics or any high performance domain, it creates a particular vulnerability. Every setback becomes not just a performance issue, but an existential threat. Every success becomes something that must be defended at all costs because it's not just about the achievement, it's about who you are as a person. But here's where it gets interesting from a performance perspective. Athletes with these broader, more multifaceted identities don't perform worse. In fact, they often show more consistent performance over time. They're able to maintain what the research calls psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to bounce back from setbacks, to find new sources of motivation when old ones fade. This brings us to something really fundamental about how purpose and meaning interact with performance. The research is showing us clear differences between athletes who align their performance goals with personal meaning and service values versus those who focus primarily on ego or outcome goals. And the differences are striking. When performance goals are connected to something beyond just winning, when they're tied to personal growth, to contributing to a team or community, to serving something larger than yourself, several things happen. First, burnout risk decreases significantly. The emotional exhaustion that comes from constantly measuring yourself against external standards lessens. But here's what might surprise you: performance consistency actually improves. Athletes with these meaning centered, service oriented goals show better coping strategies under pressure. They use what researchers call adaptive coping, problem solving approaches, positive reframing, effective use of social support. They're more likely to re engage with new goals after setbacks rather than getting stuck in rumination or withdrawal. Their performance shows less volatility under pressure because their self worth isn't riding entirely on each outcome. Now, let's talk about something that might feel particularly relevant to many of you: the phenomenon that gets called effortless excellence. You know those moments where everything just flows, where you're performing at the highest level, but it doesn't feel forced? The research is starting to unpack what's actually happening in these states, and it's fascinating. First, there's something called metacognitive regulation happening. Elite performers in these flow states are constantly but unconsciously monitoring and adjusting their focus, shifting between automatic and controlled processing as needed. But here's the key: they're doing this without conscious effort. It's like having a master conductor orchestrating everything behind the scenes while you simply experience the music. There's also something called neural efficiency happening. Brain imaging studies show that experts in these effortless states actually show less cortical activation than you might expect. Their brains are achieving more with less effort. There's increased alpha wave activity associated with relaxation and theta wave activity associated with focused attention, but overall, the brain is working more efficiently, not harder. And then there's this fascinating phenomenon called transient hypofrontality. Essentially, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain associated with self criticism, self consciousness, and overthinking, actually downregulates during these peak performance states. You literally lose the capacity for self judgment in these moments, which allows for this fluid, automatic action that characterizes true excellence. These states, what researchers call flow states, are characterized by total absorption, a merging of action and awareness, and this paradoxical sense of control. Athletes feel completely in command, but without consciously striving for control. And here's what matters: these states can be cultivated. They're not just random occurrences that happen to lucky people. Through specific practices, through creating the right conditions, performers can increase the likelihood of accessing these states. I want to talk now about something that might feel vulnerable for many high performers: the role of self compassion and acceptance in sustaining excellence. The research on this is really changing how we think about mental toughness and resilience. Studies consistently show that athletes who practice self compassion, and by this I mean treating themselves with the same kindness they would offer a good friend, recognizing that imperfection is part of the human experience, and maintaining balanced awareness of difficult emotions rather than over identifying with them. These athletes show some remarkable patterns. First, they recover faster from negative emotions after failure. There's actually physiological evidence for this. Higher self compassion is linked to what's called greater vagal reactivity, which is your body's to regulate stress responses. But here's what might surprise you: these athletes also show better performance consistency over time. Self compassion is positively associated with what researchers call eudaimonic well being, a sense of meaning, autonomy, and vitality in sport. Athletes with higher self compassion report feeling more satisfied with their performance, less anxious about competitions, and paradoxically, more motivated to improve. They're not becoming complacent. They're creating a psychological foundation that allows them to push themselves from a place of strength rather than fear. The research on acceptance based approaches shows similar patterns. Athletes who can accept difficult emotions, who can tolerate distress without immediately trying to escape or fix it, show greater emotional resilience and more stable performance under pressure. They're not getting caught in these loops of resistance and struggle that actually amplify distress and interfere with performance. And this connects to something really important about how the coaching and training environment shapes all of this. The research is incredibly clear on what types of environments best support both high performance and psychological well being over time. Environments that are autonomy supportive, where coaches encourage input, offer meaningful choices, respect athletes' perspectives, consistently produce athletes with greater intrinsic motivation, well being, and performance. These environments satisfy what psychologists call basic psychological needs: the need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When these needs are met, athletes can perform from a place of genuine engagement rather than external pressure. Coaching climates that are characterized by genuine care, by empathy, by a focus on personal growth rather than just outcomes. These environments produce athletes who show lower stress, greater enjoyment, more resilience, and stronger motivation to continue in their sport long term. They create what researchers call psychological safety, a sense that you can take risks, make mistakes, and show vulnerability without being punished or diminished. There's also compelling research on what's called transformational leadership in coaching. Coaches who articulate a vision beyond just winning, who provide individualized support, who model ethical behavior and genuine care for athlete well being. These coaches produce athletes who not only perform better, but who thrive psychologically. The athletes report higher satisfaction, better team cohesion, and importantly, they maintain their love for the sport longer. Now, I want to address something that many of you might be thinking about. What happens when you integrate structured being time into actual training blocks? Can you really maintain competitive edge while also prioritizing these non striving states? The research on this is actually quite encouraging. Studies have looked at athletes who incorporate what you might think of as being time meditative sessions, time in nature, playful movement without goals, into their regular training cycles. These aren't replacing training, they're integrated into it. What they find is that these structured cycles of being time, particularly when placed strategically within training blocks, enhance focus and reduce anxiety before competitions. Athletes who engage in even brief mindfulness sessions after intense training show significantly higher heart rate variability, enhanced vagal tone, and lower heart rates compared to those who just rest passively. Their bodies are literally recovering more effectively. But beyond the physical recovery, something important is happening psychologically. These being times serve as a kind of reset for the nervous system and the mind. They interrupt the constant striving mode that can lead to burnout and decreased performance over time. They allow athletes to remember why they started, to reconnect with the joy and curiosity that initially drew them to their sport. The research shows that these effects are particularly pronounced when the being time is regular and integrated rather than sporadic. It's not about taking a meditation retreat once a year. It's about building in these moments of non striving awareness daily or several times per week. Even 15 minutes of guided mindfulness after training can produce measurable changes in both physiological markers and psychological states. There's something else I want to explore with you, and it might be particularly relevant if you're someone who's either recently achieved a major goal or missed one. The research on how athletes redefine purpose and joy after these major milestones is really illuminating. What we see consistently is that athletes who thrive after either reaching or missing major external goals, making an Olympic team or not, winning a championship or coming up short, these athletes engage in what researchers call identity work. They actively reconstruct their sense of self beyond the specific achievement or disappointment. This often involves exploring new roles. Maybe you become a mentor to younger athletes. Maybe you discover an interest in the science behind your sport. Maybe you reconnect with creative pursuits you'd set aside during peak training years. The key is that these aren't consolation prizes or backup plans. They're genuine expansions of who you are as a person. The athletes who struggle most are those whose entire narrative, entire sense of self, was wrapped up in that one goal. When the goal is achieved, there's often a sense of emptiness. Now what? When it's missed, there can be a complete collapse of identity. But athletes who maintain what researchers call narrative flexibility, the ability to tell different stories about who they are and what matters to them, these individuals show remarkable resilience. There's fascinating research on different types of narratives athletes construct and how these relate to long term well being. Athletes who create what are called purpose based narratives, stories that emphasize intrinsic meaning, growth, contribution to others, show the highest levels of psychological well being over time. They report less depression, less anxiety, higher life satisfaction, and importantly, they maintain their connection to their sport in healthier ways. In contrast, athletes with performance based narratives, where self worth is entirely contingent on achievements, show higher levels of distress, more difficulty with transitions, and paradoxically, often less consistent performance over time because the pressure becomes so overwhelming. The research also identifies something called growth and accommodation narratives. These are stories where athletes find meaning in adversity, where setbacks become opportunities for discovering new strengths or directions. Athletes who can construct these narratives after missed goals or injuries show what's called post traumatic growth. They don't just recover to baseline, they actually develop new capacities, relationships, and sources of meaning. Now, let me share something about the neuroscience behind different types of confidence that I think really speaks to everything we've been discussing. Researchers have identified distinct neural patterns between what they call grounded confidence versus contingent confidence, and the implications for performance are profound. Grounded confidence, confidence based in self acceptance, self compassion, what we might call an internal sense of worth regardless of outcomes, shows up in the brain as increased gamma band activity, particularly in frontal regions. This pattern reflects integrated self processing, emotional regulation, and attentional stability. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex shows enhanced activity that supports self compassion and emotional balance. Contingent confidence, confidence that depends on winning, on external validation, on comparing yourself favorably to others, shows a different pattern. There's greater neural reactivity in areas associated with self judgment and emotional processing. The posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus, areas involved in self referential thinking and rumination, show heightened activity, especially when facing negative feedback or poor performance. Here's why this matters for performance. The neural patterns associated with grounded confidence predict more stable performance over time. These athletes show better emotional regulation under pressure, more consistent attention, and less vulnerability to the ups and downs that are inevitable in any performance domain. The neural patterns of contingent confidence, on the other hand, predict greater performance volatility. When confidence is tied to outcomes and outcomes naturally vary, confidence becomes unstable, and so does performance. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. Everything I'm sharing might sound good in theory, but if you're someone who's been operating in high performance environments for years or decades, changing these patterns isn't simple. Your nervous system has been shaped by years of certain ways of thinking and being. Your identity has been forged in the fires of competition and achievement. But here's what the intervention research shows us: these patterns can shift. Mindfulness based interventions with athletes consistently show improvements, not just in well being, but in performance markers. Even relatively brief interventions, 8 weeks is common in the research, can produce measurable changes in attention, emotional regulation, and performance consistency. Psychological skills training that includes components like self compassion, acceptance, and values clarification shows similar effects. Athletes learn to relate differently to their thoughts and emotions, to create space between themselves and their performance, to maintain perspective even in high stakes situations. And crucially, when coaches are trained in these approaches, when the environment supports these different ways of being, the effects are even stronger. This isn't about individual athletes trying to swim against the current of their training culture. It's about creating cultures that support both excellence and wholeness. Let me talk about something specific that many of you might be grappling with: the relationship between meaning, service, and sustained high performance. The research on this is particularly relevant for athletes and performers who've been at it for many years and are starting to question whether the pure pursuit of excellence is enough. When athletes connect their performance to something beyond themselves, and this doesn't have to be grand or altruistic, it can be as simple as inspiring one young person or contributing to your team's culture. Several things happen. First, the pressure paradoxically decreases. When it's not all about you, when your worth as a human being isn't riding on every performance, you can actually perform more freely. But there's also something about service and contribution that seems to tap into deeper sources of motivation. The research on self determination theory shows that when our actions connect to what are called intrinsic motivations — personal growth, relationships, contribution to community — we have more sustainable energy than when we're driven purely by extrinsic motivations like prizes, recognition, or avoiding failure. Athletes who frame their participation in terms of service to their sport, to their team, to the younger generation show different patterns of stress response. They still care deeply about performance, but the stress is what researchers call challenge stress rather than threat stress. Their bodies mobilize resources for action rather than going into protective defensive modes. There's also fascinating research on how different sports cultures either support or inhibit these adaptive patterns. Sports with rigid performance cultures, where worth is entirely determined by results, where any sign of vulnerability is seen as weakness, these environments make it much harder for athletes to develop the kind of multifaceted identities and purpose based narratives that support long term thriving. In contrast, sports cultures that value personal development, that see athletes as whole people, that create space for interests and growth beyond just performance, these environments produce athletes who not only perform better over time, but who maintain their love for the sport and show better psychological health throughout and after their careers. This brings me to something I want to be really direct about. The old model of mental toughness, the idea that you just need to push through, suppress doubts, ignore pain, never show weakness, this model is increasingly being challenged by the research. What we're learning is that true resilience, sustainable excellence, comes from something quite different. It comes from the ability to be with difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. It comes from the capacity to acknowledge struggles while maintaining perspective. It comes from being able to rest deeply so you can effort fully. It comes from knowing who you are beyond your performance so that you can bring your whole self to your performance. The athletes who last, who maintain not just their competitive edge, but their love for what they do, they've figured out something important. They've learned that excellence and exhaustion don't have to be partners. They've discovered that you can be world class while also being whole. And let me share something about recovery that I think encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about. The research on recovery in elite athletes is showing us that it's not just about physical rest. The athletes who recover most effectively, who maintain performance over long seasons and careers, they understand recovery as a multifaceted process. Yes, there's the physical component: sleep, nutrition, physical therapy. But there's also cognitive recovery, time away from thinking about the sport, engaging different parts of the brain. There's emotional recovery, processing the ups and downs, the pressures and disappointments. And there's what we might call spiritual or existential recovery, reconnecting with why you do this, what it means to you beyond the medals and records. Athletes who engage in what researchers call proactive recovery, deliberately engaging in activities that restore different dimensions of themselves, dash show better performance consistency and lower burnout rates. This might look like time in nature, creative pursuits, meaningful conversations with people outside the sport, or yes, mindfulness and meditation practices. The key is that recovery becomes not just something you do so you can train again tomorrow, but something that reconnects you with the fuller dimensions of who you are. It becomes part of maintaining that multifaceted identity we talked about earlier. I want to address something that might be coming up for some of you. You might be thinking, this all sounds nice, but I'm in a competitive environment where any sign of stepping back, of not giving maximum effort all the time, is seen as weakness. How do I navigate this? The research actually addresses this directly. First, it's important to recognize that what we're talking about isn't about effort or commitment. The athletes who practice these approaches often train just as hard, sometimes harder, than those operating from pure striving. The difference is in the quality of effort, the presence of recovery, the broader perspective they maintain. Second, the performance results speak for themselves. When athletes integrate these approaches, their performance typically improves or at least maintains, while their well being significantly improves. This isn't about choosing well being over performance, it's about recognizing that sustainable high performance requires well being. Third, and this is important, change often needs to happen at the team or organizational level, not just the individual level. When coaches understand these principles, when teams create cultures that support both excellence and wholeness, individual athletes don't have to feel like they're going against the grain. There's something else about identity and narrative that I think is worth exploring further. The research shows that athletes who can tell multiple stories about themselves, who have what's called narrative flexibility, show better outcomes across the board. They're not locked into one rigid story about who they are and what their life means. This becomes particularly important during transitions, whether that's transitioning from junior to senior competition, dealing with injury, or eventually transitioning out of competitive sport. Athletes with a narrative flexibility can adapt their stories. An injury isn't just a disaster, it might also be an opportunity to develop other aspects of themselves. Missing a team selection isn't just failure, it might be redirection towards something else meaningful. The intervention research shows that athletes can develop this narrative flexibility through guided reflection, through exposure to different life stories and possibilities, through deliberate identity exploration exercises. Athletes can expand their sense of who they are and who they might become. I want to circle back to something fundamental about the nature of excellence itself. We tend to think of excellence as something that requires constant striving, constant pushing against limits. But what if excellence could also emerge from a kind of allowing? What if peak performance could arise not just from effort, but from a kind of surrendering to the moment, to the thousands of hours of preparation that have brought you to this point? This isn't passive. It's not about not caring or not trying. It's about a different quality of engagement. It's about being so present, so connected to what you're doing, that the doing happens through you rather than being forced by you. Athletes describe this as being in the zone, in flow, but it's more than just a peak experience. It can become a way of being in relationship with your craft. The research on expertise shows us something interesting here. True experts, those who've reached the highest levels of performance, often describe a kind of simplicity in their approach. After years of complexity, of analyzing every detail, they return to basics, but with a depth of understanding that transforms those basics into something profound. This relates to what we discussed about neural efficiency. The expert brain doesn't work harder, it works smarter. It knows what to pay attention to and what to let fade into the background. It can shift between focused and diffuse attention as needed. It can engage fully without depleting unnecessarily. For those of you listening who are coaches or who work with high performers, I want to emphasize something from the research. Your role in creating environments that support these different ways of being is crucial. Athletes don't develop in isolation, they develop in relationship with coaches, teammates, the culture of their sport. When you, as a coach, model acceptance alongside high standards, when you show that caring about athlete well being and pushing for excellence aren't contradictory, when you create space for athletes to be human beings who happen to do sport rather than machines that exist only to produce results, you're not just supporting their well being, you're actually supporting their performance potential. The research on autonomy supportive coaching is particularly compelling here. When coaches support athlete autonomy, their sense of choice, their input into training decisions, their individual paths to excellence, athletes show higher intrinsic motivation, better performance, and greater longevity in sport. They're performing because they choose to, not because they have to, and this makes all the difference. As we start to wrap up, I want to return to where we began, that space where excellence meets exhaustion, where love for what you do gets buried under the weight of constant measurement and pressure. What I hope you're taking from our time together is that there's another way. This other way doesn't mean giving up your edge. It doesn't mean settling for mediocrity or not caring about results. It means finding a way to pursue excellence that doesn't deplete you, that actually nourishes you even as it challenges you. It means competing from a place of groundedness rather than desperation, from self compassion rather than self criticism, from meaning rather than just measurement. The research we've explored today isn't just academic theory. It's based on real athletes, real performers, real people who've found ways to sustain excellence while also sustaining themselves. They've discovered that performing from being rather than striving, maintaining multiple valued identities, connecting performance to purpose and service, practicing self compassion and acceptance, these aren't soft alternatives to real training. They're sophisticated approaches to sustainable excellence. If you're someone who's been grinding for years, who feels that familiar ache of depletion even as you continue to achieve, I want you to know that feeling isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're human, that you're more than just your results, that some part of you is calling for a different way forward. That different way might start small. Maybe it's 5 minutes of mindfulness after training. Maybe it's reconnecting with why you started this journey in the first place. Maybe it's allowing yourself to have an identity beyond your performance. Maybe it's finding one way to connect your craft to service or contribution beyond yourself. The path to sustainable excellence isn't about doing less, it's about being more, more present, more whole, more connected to what matters beyond the next competition or achievement. It's about recognizing that your worth as a human being isn't contingent on your last performance or your next one. For those of you standing at that crossroads between excellence and exhaustion, know that you don't have to choose one or the other. There's a path that honors both your drive for excellence and your need for wholeness. It requires courage to step off the familiar track of constant striving, to experiment with different ways of being, to risk being seen as different in cultures that often reward only one way of being. But the research suggests, and the experiences of countless athletes confirm, that this courage is rewarded not just with better well being, but often with better performance. When you're not performing from fear or desperation, when you're not carrying the weight of your entire identity on every attempt, you're free to actually express the fullness of your capabilities. Excellence without exhaustion isn't just possible, it might actually be the key to the highest levels of sustainable performance. It requires rethinking some fundamental assumptions about what drives performance, what mental toughness really means, what it takes to stay at the top. But perhaps most importantly, it requires recognizing that you are more than your performance. You are a human being who happens to be excellent at something, not an excellence machine that happens to be human. That distinction might seem subtle, but it changes everything about how you train, how you compete, how you recover, and ultimately, how you sustain both your performance and your love for what you do. The journey from striving to being, from exhaustion to sustainable excellence, isn't always easy. It requires unlearning patterns that might have served you to get to where you are, but that won't sustain you going forward. It requires the courage to be vulnerable, to acknowledge limits, to expand your sense of self beyond your achievements. But on the other side of that journey is something precious: the ability to maintain your edge without losing your center, to compete with steadiness instead of strain, to remain world class while also remaining whole. That's not just a nice idea. According to the research, it's an achievable reality. And it might just be the key to not only sustaining your performance, but rediscovering your love for the thing that once brought you so much joy. Thank you for joining me today on Strides to Solutions. Remember, the path forward isn't about choosing between excellence and well being. It's about discovering how they can support each other, how being more whole can actually make you better at what you do. Until next time, this is Esther Adams, reminding you that sustainable excellence is not only possible, it's already being lived by performers who found another way.